They called her the unsinkable ship, a floating palace of steel and luxury that represented the pinnacle of human engineering and ambition at the dawn of the 20th century. The RMS Titanic was more than a vessel designed to cross the Atlantic Ocean. She was a symbol of progress, a testament to what human ingenuity could accomplish, and a demonstration of the White Star Line's determination to dominate the transatlantic passenger trade. At 882 feet long and 92 feet wide, displacing 46,000 tons, the Titanic was the largest moving object ever built by human hands. Her designers incorporated the most advanced safety features of the era, including watertight compartments that could be sealed at the throw of a switch, and they believed she was virtually unsinkable. The press and the public embraced this confidence, and the Titanic's maiden voyage in April 1912 was anticipated as a triumph of modern technology and a celebration of Edwardian luxury. But on the night of April 14, 1912, just 4 days into her first journey from Southampton to New York, the Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Within 2 hours and 40 minutes, the greatest ship in the world had broken apart and sunk to the ocean floor, taking more than 1,500 people with her. This is not a story about fate or divine punishment. This is a story about hubris, about corners cut and warnings ignored, about class divisions that determined who lived and who died, and about the terrible price of overconfidence. This is the story of the Titanic, a disaster that shocked the world and changed maritime safety forever. The White Star Line and the race for Atlantic supremacy. To understand the Titanic, one must first understand the fierce competition that drove her creation. In the early 20th century, the transatlantic passenger trade was enormously profitable and intensely competitive. Steamship companies competed to build the largest, fastest, and most luxurious ships to attract wealthy passengers and lucrative mail contracts. The two dominant British lines were Cunard and White Star, and they approached the challenge differently. Cunard focused on speed, building vessels like the Lusitania and Mauretania that could cross the Atlantic in record time, and could claim the prestigious Blue Riband for the fastest crossing. These ships were powered by revolutionary turbine engines that allowed them to sustain speeds of more than 25 knots for days at a time, cutting the transatlantic crossing to less than 5 days. White Star, unable to match Cunard's speed advantage due to limitations in engine technology and funding, chose instead to compete on size and luxury. The company's strategy was to build ships that would be slower but more comfortable, offering accommodations and amenities that would appeal to passengers who valued a pleasant journey over sheer speed. This approach had worked well with previous ships, and White Star's management believed it could be successful on an even grander scale. The White Star Line was owned by the International Mercantile Marine Company, a conglomerate controlled by American financier J.P. Morgan. Morgan had assembled IMM by purchasing several British and American shipping lines with the goal of creating a monopoly on transatlantic passenger and cargo traffic. White Star was the jewel of this empire, and Morgan was willing to invest heavily in new ships that would enhance the line's reputation and profitability. In 1907, White Star's chairman J. Bruce Ismay met with Lord Peary, the chairman of Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast, to discuss a plan for 3 massive new ships that would eclipse anything afloat. These ships, Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, would be the largest in the world, offering unprecedented luxury and accommodations. They would not be the fastest ships, but they would be the most impressive, attracting passengers who valued comfort and prestige over speed. The ships would be nearly identical in design, with improvements and modifications incorporated into each successive vessel based on experience with the earlier ones. The decision to build these ships was driven by economics and ego. The transatlantic trade was lucrative, and larger ships could carry more passengers and cargo, generating greater revenue per voyage. A ship carrying 2,400 passengers could earn far more than 3 ships carrying 800 passengers each, particularly when the operating costs were considered. The prestige of operating the world's largest ships would enhance White Star's reputation and attract the wealthiest passengers, who would pay premium fares for the best accommodations. For Harland and Wolff, the contract to build 3 massive ships represented years of guaranteed work and substantial profit, cementing the shipyard's position as one of the world's premier shipbuilders and ensuring employment for thousands of workers. The relationship between White Star and Harland and Wolff was unique in the shipping industry. Unlike most ship owners who solicited competitive bids from multiple yards, White Star had an exclusive arrangement with Harland and Wolff. The shipyard built all of White Star's vessels on a cost-plus basis, with no formal contract and no competitive bidding. This arrangement was based on trust and a long history of collaboration, but it also meant that there was less incentive to control costs or to question design decisions that might add expense. The relationship would later be scrutinized by investigators looking for factors that might have compromised the Titanic's safety. The construction of the Titanic. Construction of the Titanic began on March 31, 1909, at Harland and Wolff's shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland. The shipyard occupied a prominent position on the Belfast waterfront, and its massive gantries and cranes dominated the city's skyline. To accommodate the construction of the Olympic and Titanic simultaneously, the shipyard had to be modified significantly. 2 existing slipways were combined into one enormous construction site, and a massive gantry was built that allowed workers to access all levels of the ships during construction. More than 15,000 workers were employed in building the Titanic, including shipwrights, riveters, plumbers, electricians, carpenters, painters, and laborers. The workforce represented a cross-section of Belfast society, from highly skilled craftsmen who had spent years learning their trades to unskilled laborers who performed the heavy, dangerous work of moving materials and equipment. The work was dangerous, and industrial accidents were common. Workers fell from scaffolding, were struck by falling materials, were injured by machinery, or were killed in the cramped, hazardous conditions of the ship's interior. At least 8 workers were killed during the construction of the Titanic, and many more were injured. These deaths were seen as the unfortunate but inevitable cost of building such a massive vessel, and they received little attention beyond the immediate families of the victims. The Titanic's keel was laid down first, providing the backbone of the ship from which the rest of the structure would rise. The keel and the framework of the ship were constructed from massive steel beams and plates, creating a skeleton that would be covered with the ship's hull plating. The construction used traditional riveting techniques, with millions of rivets, steel in most areas, but iron in the bow and stern, where the hull plates were thinner and the stresses were expected to be lower, being driven by hand or by hydraulic riveters to join the steel plates to the frame. The quality of the rivets would later become a subject of investigation and debate. Some rivets were made of inferior iron rather than steel, and metallurgical analysis conducted decades later on rivets recovered from the wreck suggested that some had high slag content that made them brittle and prone to failure when subjected to impact. The use of iron rivets rather than steel rivets in some areas was a cost-saving measure and reflected the standard practice of the time, but it may have contributed to the extent of the damage when the ship struck the iceberg. The riveting itself was also variable in quality. Some rivets were properly driven and created strong, watertight joints. Others were poorly installed, creating weak points where the hull plates could separate under stress. The Titanic was launched on May 31st, 1911, in a ceremony attended by thousands of spectators who gathered to watch the massive hull slide down the slipway into the water. The launch was the easy part, simply releasing the ship to slide down the greased slipway into Belfast Lough. The ship entered the water without any problems, and she floated exactly as designed, confirming the accuracy of the naval architect's calculations. But the launch marked only the beginning of the next phase of construction. The real work came afterward, as the ship was moved to a fitting-out berth, where she would be transformed from an empty hull into a functioning vessel. The fitting-out process took nearly a year and involved installing the engines, boilers, electrical systems, plumbing, heating and ventilation systems, and all the interior furnishings that would make the Titanic a floating palace. The ship's propulsion system consisted of two massive reciprocating steam engines, each driving a wing propeller and a single steam turbine that drove a central propeller. The engines were powered by 29 boilers, each containing multiple furnaces that were fed by coal shoveled by hand, by more than 170 stokers working in shifts. The boilers produced steam at high pressure, which drove the pistons of the reciprocating engines and the blades of the turbine, generating a total of approximately 46,000 horsepower. The ship's electrical system was state-of-the-art for its time, with electric lighting throughout the vessel, electric heaters in first-class cabins, electric elevators serving the upper decks, and electric motors operating pumps, winches, and other machinery. The electrical system was powered by 4 generators driven by steam from the boilers, providing enough electricity to power a small city. The redundancy in the electrical system was considered a safety feature, as the failure of 1 or even 2 generators would not leave the ship without power. The interior of the Titanic was fitted out with extraordinary attention to detail and luxury, at least in the first-class areas. The first-class public rooms were decorated in various period styles, including Louis XVI, English Renaissance, and Jacobean. The first-class dining saloon could seat more than 500 people and featured intricately carved oak paneling, crystal chandeliers, and plush carpeting. The first-class lounge was decorated in the style of the Palace of Versailles, with gilt mirrors, tapestries, and ornate furniture. The first-class smoking room was paneled in mahogany and featured stained glass windows and mother-of-pearl inlays. The grand staircase, which connected the boat deck to E-deck, was one of the ship's most impressive features, with elaborately carved oak panels, a wrought iron balustrade, and a glass dome that allowed natural light to filter down to the lower levels. First-class cabins ranged from standard inside rooms to lavish suites with private promenades. The most expensive accommodations were the parlor suites, which included a sitting room, 1 or 2 bedrooms, a private bathroom with a full-size tub, and a private promenade deck. These suites were decorated with real furniture, rather than the built-in furnishings common in most cabins, and they featured amenities like electric heating and ornate decorative details. Second-class accommodations on the Titanic were comparable to first class on most other ships. Second-class cabins were paneled in oak or pine and featured comfortable beds, washstands, and adequate lighting. The second-class dining saloon was spacious and well-appointed, and second-class passengers had access to their own library, smoking room, and promenade areas. The second-class facilities reflected the Titanic's positioning as a ship that offered excellent accommodations across all classes, not just for the wealthy elite. Third-class accommodations were basic, but adequate by the standards of the time. Third-class cabins typically accommodated 4 to 6 passengers in bunk beds, with communal bathrooms and washrooms located on each deck. The third-class dining room was large and functional, serving simple but filling meals. Third-class passengers had access to their own general room for socializing, and to areas on the aft well deck where they could get fresh air and exercise. Compared to steerage accommodations on many other ships, which were often overcrowded and squalid, the Titanic's third-class areas were considered relatively comfortable. The ship was designed with safety features that were advanced for the time, though they would prove to be inadequate. The Titanic had 16 watertight compartments, created by 15 transverse bulkheads, walls that ran across the width of the ship. These bulkheads could be closed by watertight doors operated from the bridge, sealing the compartments and theoretically preventing water from flooding the entire ship. The doors could be closed manually by crew members in each compartment, or they could be closed remotely by throwing a switch on the bridge, which released the doors to drop by gravity. The system was designed to allow rapid sealing of the compartments in an emergency, giving the ship time to reach port, even if several compartments were flooded. The ship was designed to remain afloat even if 2 of the central compartments or the first 4 compartments were flooded. This was considered more than adequate, as no accident scenario could be imagined that would breach more than 4 compartments simultaneously. Naval architects and White Star management believed that this design made the ship practically unsinkable. This belief was reinforced by advertising and press coverage that described the ship as unsinkable, though White Star never officially used that exact term. However, the watertight compartments had a critical flaw that was not widely recognized at the time. The bulkheads did not extend all the way to the upper decks. Most rose only to E deck, which was well above the waterline under normal circumstances. The assumption was that flooding would not rise high enough to spill over the tops of the bulkheads. But this assumption did not account for what would happen if the bow of the ship was pushed down into the water by flooding in the forward compartments. In such a scenario, water could spill over the top of one bulkhead into the next compartment, then over that bulkhead into the following compartment, progressively flooding the entire ship from bow to stern. This design flaw would prove fatal. The Titanic was also equipped with a double bottom, a second hull beneath the main hull, creating a space between them that could fill with water in the event of a breach to the bottom of the ship without immediately sinking the vessel. This feature provided protection against running aground or striking submerged objects, and it was required by maritime regulations. However, the double bottom did not extend up the sides of the ship, leaving the sides vulnerable to damage. A collision that breached the side of the ship, as the iceberg impact would do, would flood directly into the main compartments, bypassing the protection offered by the double bottom. The ship's lifeboats were another area where safety was given insufficient attention. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats with a total capacity of 1,178 people. This included 16 wooden lifeboats under davits, which could be lowered to the water, and 4 collapsible boats with canvas sides that could be assembled if needed. This was actually more than required by British Board of Trade regulations, which were based on the ship's tonnage rather than the number of people aboard, and which had not been updated since 1894, when ships were much smaller. The regulations required ships over 10,000 tons to carry lifeboats for only 962 people, so the Titanic's lifeboat capacity exceeded the legal requirement by more than 200 spaces. However, the ship could carry more than 3,300 passengers and crew when fully loaded, meaning that even if all lifeboats were filled to capacity, less than 40% of those aboard could be accommodated. The ship's designers had actually considered installing more lifeboats, and the davits, the mechanisms used to lower boats, were designed to handle additional boats. Some preliminary plans showed as many as 64 lifeboats, which would have been sufficient for everyone aboard. But the decision was made to limit the number to 20 to preserve deck space and aesthetics. Passengers paying premium fares for first-class accommodations expected unobstructed promenade decks, and filling those decks with rows of lifeboats would have detracted from the luxury atmosphere. This decision to prioritize aesthetics and passenger comfort over safety would condemn more than 1,500 people to death. The decision reflected a broader assumption about how lifeboats would be used in an emergency. The prevailing view was that lifeboats were primarily needed to ferry passengers from a sinking ship to rescue vessels, not to accommodate everyone aboard for an extended period. The North Atlantic was a busy shipping lane, and it was assumed that if a ship got into trouble, other vessels would quickly respond and take passengers aboard. The lifeboats would shuttle back and forth between the sinking ship and the rescue vessels, with each lifeboat making multiple trips. This scenario assumed that the ship would sink slowly enough to allow multiple boat trips, that rescue vessels would arrive quickly, and that the sea would be calm enough to allow safe boat operations. In the case of the Titanic, none of these assumptions would prove correct. The ship would sink in less than 3 hours, no rescue vessel would arrive before she went down, and the lifeboats would have to carry survivors for several hours across an icy ocean before being picked up. The maiden voyage. The Titanic completed her sea trials on April 2, 1912, and was declared ready for service. The trials consisted of a few hours of sailing in Belfast Lough and the Irish Sea, during which the ship's speed, turning ability, and stopping distance were tested. The trials were perfunctory compared to the extensive testing that modern ships undergo, but they were considered adequate at the time. The ship performed as expected, and she was officially handed over to the White Star Line. 8 days later, on April 10th, She departed Southampton on her maiden voyage to New York. The departure was nearly marred by a collision when the suction created by the Titanic's massive hull, as she pulled away from the dock, caused the moored liner New York to break her moorings and swing toward the Titanic. Quick action by the Titanic's crew and by tugboats prevented a collision, but the near miss created a delay and was seen by some as an ill omen. The ship proceeded without further incident, making stops at Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, now Cove, Ireland, to pick up additional passengers before heading across the Atlantic. The passenger list was a cross-section of Edwardian society, from the super-rich to poor immigrants seeking new lives in America. First-class passengers included some of the wealthiest people in the world. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in America, was traveling with his young second wife Madeline, who was pregnant. Benjamin Guggenheim, a mining magnate from a family that controlled much of the world's copper supply, was accompanied by his mistress and her maid. Isidor Straus and his wife Ida, owners of Macy's department store, were returning from a European vacation. Margaret Molly Brown, an American socialite and philanthropist who had made her fortune in the Colorado Gold Rush, was traveling alone. Also aboard were industrialists, financiers, military officers, artists, and socialites, creating a concentration of wealth and influence rarely seen in one place. These passengers occupied lavish suites and staterooms decorated in various period styles, dined on gourmet cuisine in the palatial first-class dining saloon, and enjoyed amenities including a gymnasium equipped with the latest exercise machines, a swimming pool, a squash court, and a Turkish bath, styled after those in Constantinople. The first-class areas of the ship were designed to rival the finest hotels and resorts in Europe, and passengers were encouraged to dress formally for dinner and to participate in the social rituals of high society. Second-class passengers were middle-class travelers, professors, clergymen, business people, skilled workers, and their families, who enjoyed accommodations that would have been considered first class on most other ships. Their cabins were comfortable and well-appointed, their dining room was elegant and served quality food, and they had access to their own promenade decks and public rooms, including a library and a smoking room. Second-class passengers paid substantial fares, and they expected and received good service and comfortable conditions. Third-class passengers, also known as steerage, were primarily immigrants from Europe seeking new opportunities in America. They came from Ireland, Scandinavia, Italy, the Balkans, and the Middle East, carrying with them everything they owned and hoping to build new lives in the New World. They occupied the lower decks in small cabins or dormitories, with families often sharing cramped spaces with strangers. Communal bathrooms and washrooms were located on each deck, and meals were served in large dining rooms where passengers sat at long tables and ate simple but filling food. While their accommodations were basic, they were better than those on many other ships. The Titanic's third-class areas were relatively clean, well-ventilated, and adequately lit, and third-class passengers had access to open deck space where they could get fresh air and exercise. The class divisions on the Titanic were rigid and enforced. Gates and locked doors separated the classes, and third-class passengers were largely confined to their areas of the ship, particularly during the early days of the voyage when immigration inspections had not yet been completed. This segregation was standard practice on passenger ships of the era, reflecting the social hierarchies of the time and the desire of first-class passengers to maintain their privacy and exclusivity. The segregation was also required by U.S. immigration law, which mandated that steerage passengers be kept separate until they had been inspected and cleared for entry at Ellis Island. These regulations would have deadly consequences when the ship began to sink, and third-class passengers found their way to the boat deck blocked by locked gates and closed doors. The Titanic's crew numbered about 900, including the ship's officers, engineers who operated and maintained the engines and boilers, stokers who shoveled coal into the furnaces, trimmers who moved coal from storage bunkers to the boiler room, stewards and stewardesses who served passengers, restaurant staff who prepared and served meals, and sailors who operated the ship's boats and deck equipment. Many crew members were experienced seamen who had served on other White Star vessels. but some had joined the ship only days before departure and were unfamiliar with her layout and procedures. The ship was under the command of Captain Edward Smith, a veteran of the White Star Line with 40 years of experience at sea. Smith was 62 years old and had commanded most of White Star's major vessels during his career. He had a reputation for competence and caution, and he was popular with passengers for his dignified manner and his willingness to socialize in the first-class public rooms. This was to be his final voyage before retirement, a fitting end to a distinguished career. Instead, it would be his tomb. The first days of the voyage were uneventful and pleasant. The weather was calm, the sea was smooth, and the Titanic performed well, with no mechanical problems or operational difficulties. Passengers settled into the rhythms of shipboard life, exploring the vessel's vast public rooms, dining on elaborate multi-course meals, socializing with fellow travelers, attending church services on Sunday morning, and enjoying the novelty of traveling on the world's largest ship. The ship's speed was gradually increased as her engines and boilers were brought to full capacity, and she was making good progress across the Atlantic, averaging about 21 to 22 knots. The night of April 14th, 1912. On Sunday, April 14th, the Titanic was steaming through calm seas under clear skies. The temperature had been dropping throughout the day as the ship moved into colder waters, and by evening the air was frigid. The sea was remarkably calm, with virtually no wind and no waves, creating a glassy surface that reflected the stars in the moonless sky. These calm conditions, while pleasant for passengers, would make it more difficult for lookouts to spot icebergs, as there would be no waves breaking against the base of the ice to create the white foam that usually makes icebergs visible at a distance. Throughout the day, the ship's wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, had received multiple ice warnings from other ships in the area, reporting icebergs and field ice in the Titanic's path. Some of these warnings were delivered to the bridge and noted by the officers. Others were not, either because the wireless operators were busy with passenger messages, which were lucrative and took priority over ship-to-ship messages that generated no revenue, or because the warnings were not deemed urgent enough to interrupt other work. The accumulation of warnings indicated that the Titanic was approaching an area of extensive ice, but the full picture was not assembled in one place, and no one on the ship understood the magnitude of the ice field ahead. Captain Smith and his officers were aware that ice was in the area, but they did not reduce speed. This decision was standard practice at the time. Ships routinely maintained speed when crossing areas where ice had been reported, relying on lookouts to spot hazards in time to avoid them. The assumption was that icebergs would be visible at a sufficient distance to allow the ship to steer around them, even at full speed. Slowing down was seen as overcautious and would delay arrival in port, which was commercially undesirable. Ships competed on speed and schedule reliability, and captains who slowed down excessively in response to ice warnings were seen as timid. There is no credible evidence that J. Bruce Ismay, who was aboard as a passenger, pressured Captain Smith to maintain speed or to arrive in New York early to generate favorable publicity. Some survivors later claimed that Ismay had encouraged speed, and Ismay's survival when so many others died made him a target for criticism and accusations. However, the preponderance of evidence suggests that the decision to maintain speed was made by Captain Smith based on standard practice, not on pressure from Ismay. Smith was an experienced captain who had crossed the Atlantic hundreds of times and who had encountered ice before without incident. He believed, as did most mariners of his era, that maintaining speed was safe as long as proper lookout was maintained. At about 9 p.m., Captain Smith retired to his cabin for the night, leaving Second Officer Charles Lightoller in command on the bridge. At 10 p.m., Lightoller was relieved by First Officer William Murdoch, who would be on watch when the iceberg was spotted. At 11:30 p.m., the Californian, a ship stopped in the ice about 20 miles away, sent a message warning the Titanic of ice directly in her path. The Titanic's wireless operator, Jack Phillips, who who was busy transmitting passenger messages to a relay station in Cape Race, Newfoundland, cut off the Californian's operator mid-message with an irritated, "Keep out! Shut up! You're jamming my signal!" The Californian's operator, his feelings hurt and his shift nearly over, shut down his wireless equipment and went to bed. This exchange meant that the most specific and urgent ice warning never reached the Titanic's bridge, and the Californian would not hear the Titanic's distress calls when the crisis came. At 11:40 p.m., lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, stationed in the crow's nest high on the forward mast, spotted an iceberg directly ahead. Fleet rang the warning bell 3 times, the signal for an object ahead, and telephoned the bridge, reporting, "Iceberg right ahead." First Officer William Murdoch, who was in command on the bridge, immediately ordered hard a starboard, which in the navigation conventions of the time meant turning the ship's bow to port or left. He also ordered the engines stopped and then reversed. The decision to reverse the engines has been debated by maritime historians and experts. Reversing the engines would slow the ship and reduce the violence of any impact, but it would also reduce the water flow past the rudder, making the ship less responsive to helm commands, and potentially reducing the effectiveness of the turn. Some experts believe that Murdoch would have done better to maintain forward speed and rely solely on the rudder to turn the ship. Others argue that the decision to reverse was correct, and that the problem was simply that there was not enough time or distance to avoid the iceberg, regardless of what action was taken. The Titanic began to turn, her bow swinging slowly to port. For a few seconds, it appeared that she might clear the iceberg, but there was not enough time. The ship was traveling at approximately 22 knots, about 25 miles per hour, and the iceberg was less than 500 yards away when it was spotted. Ships as large as the Titanic cannot turn quickly. The rudder, even at full deflection, takes time to alter the course of a vessel displacing 46,000 tons moving at high speed. Despite Murdoch's actions, the ship could not avoid the collision. 37 seconds after the iceberg was spotted, the Titanic's starboard side scraped along the submerged portion of the iceberg. The iceberg extended far below the waterline. Experts estimate that only about 1/8 of an iceberg's mass is visible above water, with the rest submerged. The underwater portion of the iceberg, with its irregular surface of ledges and protrusions, scraped along the ship's hull for about 10 seconds, opening the steel plates in multiple places along a 300-foot length of the ship's side. The damage was not a continuous gash, but a series of narrow slits and separations in the hull plates and seams, particularly in the area where iron rivets rather than steel rivets had been used. The total area of the openings was later estimated to be about 12 square feet, equivalent to a hole about 3 feet by 4 feet, but spread out over 300 feet of the hull and across multiple compartments. Most passengers and crew felt only a slight jar or grinding sensation. Some passengers in their cabins felt nothing at all and learned about the collision only when they emerged later to find out what had happened. In the first-class public rooms, conversation barely paused. Some passengers went on deck out of curiosity and saw chunks of ice on the forward well deck, where ice from the berg had fallen when the ship brushed past it. They picked up pieces as souvenirs, treating the collision as an amusing incident rather than a catastrophe. In the third-class areas at the bow, where the collision was most strongly felt, some passengers were knocked out of their bunks or awakened by the grinding noise and the shudder of impact. But below the waterline, the situation was far more serious. Water was pouring into the ship through the damaged hull, flooding the forward compartments. Within 10 minutes of the collision, Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer who was aboard to observe her performance and make note of any deficiencies that could be corrected in the Britannic, had inspected the damage and made his assessment. He examined the flooding in the cargo holds and the boiler rooms, observed the rate at which water was rising, and did the calculations in his head. 6 compartments were flooding: the forepeak, the 3 forward cargo holds, and boiler rooms 6 and 5. Water was pouring in through the damaged hull faster than the ship's pumps could remove it, and the weight of the water in the bow was already beginning to pull the ship down by the head. Andrews reported to Captain Smith. The ship was doomed. The Titanic could float with 4 compartments flooded, but not 6. As the bow sank lower from the weight of water in the forward compartments, the water would rise to the top of the watertight bulkheads and spill over into the compartments behind. The ship would progressively flood from bow to stern, and eventually, she would sink. Andrews calculated that the ship had perhaps an hour and a half, 2 hours at most. This estimate would prove to be remarkably accurate. The ship would sink in 2 hours and 40 minutes. The sinking. At 12:05 a.m., 25 minutes after the collision, Captain Smith gave the order to uncover the lifeboats and prepare to abandon ship. The order was given quietly, without general alarm, in an attempt to avoid panic. Stewards were sent to wake passengers and to tell them to put on warm clothing and life jackets and to proceed to the boat deck. Many passengers were skeptical and reluctant to leave the warmth and apparent safety of the ship for a small boat on the dark, freezing ocean. Some refused to comply, insisting that there was no danger. Others treated the order as a precaution that would soon be rescinded. At 12:15 a.m., the ship's wireless operators began sending distress signals. The Titanic used the CQD distress call, which stood for Come Quick Danger, and also the newer SOS signal, which had been introduced only a few years earlier as an international standard. The message was clear: CQD, CQD, SOS, SOS, CQD. We have struck an iceberg. Sinking. Require immediate assistance. Position 41.46 north, 50.14 west. The operators sent the message repeatedly, and several ships received it and responded. The closest was the Carpathia, a Cunard liner about 58 miles to the southeast. Her captain, Arthur Rostron, was awakened by his wireless operator with the news of the distress call. Rostron immediately ordered his ship turned around and pushed to maximum speed, racing to reach the Titanic. He ordered his crew to prepare to receive survivors, to ready lifeboats for lowering, to have blankets and hot drinks prepared, and to set up medical stations. But even at full speed, burning every ounce of coal his stokers could shovel, the Carpathia would take nearly 4 hours to reach the Titanic. The Carpathia could manage about 14 knots at best, and the 58-mile distance would require more than 4 hours to cover. Rostron knew this, and he knew that the Titanic might not stay afloat that long. There were other ships in the area. The Frankfurt, about 170 miles away, responded to the distress call. The Baltic, the Olympic, Titanic's sister ship, and several other vessels also heard the call and changed course to render assistance. But all of them were hours away, too far to arrive before the ship sank. The closest ship was the Californian, which was stopped in the ice field less than 20 miles away. But the Californian's wireless operator, Cyril Evans, had gone off duty at 11:30 p.m., just minutes before the Titanic struck the iceberg. The ship had no policy requiring 24-hour wireless coverage, and with the operator asleep, the Californian did not hear the distress calls. Some crew members on the Californian saw what they thought were signal rockets fired from a ship to the south. White rockets that rose into the air and exploded in a shower of stars. The rockets were visible around 12:45 a.m. and continued at intervals for more than an hour. These were almost certainly distress rockets fired from the Titanic, but the Californian's crew did not recognize them as distress signals. They debated among themselves what the rockets might mean, and they attempted to signal the other ship using a Morse lamp, but they received no response. The Californian's captain, Stanley Lord, was informed about the rockets, but did not order the wireless operator to be awakened or the ship to investigate. Lord would later claim that he believed the rockets were not distress signals, but some kind of company signal or celebration. This explanation has been widely disbelieved, and Lord's failure to respond to what were almost certainly distress signals has been condemned as a dereliction of duty. The debate over the Californian's actions and whether the ship could have saved lives continues to this day. At 12:25 a.m., the order was given to begin loading the lifeboats. The process was chaotic, inefficient, and hampered by multiple factors. Many passengers did not believe the ship was in serious danger and were reluctant to leave the apparent safety and comfort of the well-lit, stable ship for a small boat on the dark ocean. The crew had received no training in evacuation procedures and were uncertain about how many people each boat could safely hold. The boat's capacity was 65 people, but many crew members believed that lowering a fully loaded boat would put too much strain on the davits and ropes and that the boats might break apart or capsize. As a result, boats began to be lowered partially filled, with some leaving with only a dozen or 20 people when they could have held 65. The first boat to be lowered, Lifeboat 7 on the starboard side, left at 12:40 a.m., with only 28 people aboard, despite having capacity for 65. Lifeboat 1, designed for 40 people, left with only 12 aboard, 7 crew members and 5 passengers, including Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife, Lady Duff Gordon, who would later be accused of bribing the crew to row away from the sinking ship to avoid picking up swimmers. Lifeboat 6 left with only 24 people, including Margaret Brown and Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, who refused Brown's demands to return to pick up swimmers. The evacuation was further hampered by the class divisions built into the ship's design. Third-class passengers, housed in the lower decks in the bow and stern, had to navigate a maze of corridors and stairways to reach the boat deck, and many found their way blocked by locked gates or by crew members who did not realize the severity of the situation and were following standard procedure to keep steerage passengers separated from first and second class. Some third-class passengers eventually found their way to the upper decks by ignoring locked gates and finding alternative routes, but many did not, and they were disproportionately represented among the dead. The rule, women and children first, was generally followed, though it was enforced differently on different sides of the ship. On the port side, Second Officer Charles Lightoller interpreted the rule strictly, allowing only women and children into the boats and refusing to allow men even when boats had empty seats. Lightoller believed he was following proper procedure, and he felt it was his duty to ensure that women and children were given priority. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch and other officers allowed men to board if there were no women and children waiting. Murdoch's interpretation was more flexible, and he filled boats more completely as a result. This inconsistency meant that survival sometimes depended on which side of the ship a passenger happened to be on when seeking a lifeboat. As the minutes passed and the bow of the ship sank lower, the deck began to tilt noticeably, making it increasingly difficult to move around. The tilt also made it harder to lower the lifeboats, as they tended to swing inward against the ship's side as they were lowered. Passengers who had initially been skeptical of the danger now recognized the seriousness of the situation and began to crowd around the remaining lifeboats, though by this point many boats had already been launched partially filled. The ship's band, under the direction of Wallace Hartley, assembled on deck around 12:15 a.m. and began to play music to calm passengers and provide some measure of normalcy amid the growing chaos. The band consisted of 8 musicians, a pianist, a cellist, 3 violinists, and 3 other instrumentalists, who played ragtime, waltzes, and popular songs of the era. As the night progressed and the situation became more dire, the band is reported to have played hymns, including "Nearer My God to Thee," though accounts differ on exactly what the band played in the final minutes. What is certain is that the band continued playing even as the deck tilted steeper, even as water crept closer, even as it became clear that they would not survive. All 8 band members died in the sinking, and their bravery and dedication to duty have been commemorated in countless retellings of the disaster. At 2:05 a.m., the last lifeboat, Collapsible D, was lowered. More than 1,500 people remained aboard the ship, and there was no longer any means of escape. The ship's bow was now completely submerged, the forward well deck was underwater, and water was creeping up the promenade deck. The stern had risen high into the air, the propellers were visible above the water, and the remaining passengers and crew were forced to move toward the stern as the bow sank lower. The ship was now tilted at a steep angle, perhaps 20 or 30 degrees, and it was difficult to maintain footing on the sloping deck. The lights, which had remained on throughout the sinking, powered by the ship's generators, finally flickered and went out at about 2:17 or 2:18 a.m. as the rising water reached the boiler rooms and the fires were extinguished or the generators were flooded. In the sudden darkness, those still aboard faced their final moments. Some jumped into the water, hoping to swim away from the ship before she went down and to reach one of the lifeboats. Others clung to railings or fixtures, praying for a miracle. Some retreated to their cabins to await the end. Others gathered in groups on the stern deck, where some prayed, some sang hymns, and some simply stood in stunned silence. At approximately 2:18 a.m., the stress on the ship's structure became too great. The forward section was entirely submerged and was pulling the stern down with it, creating enormous tension on the hull. Somewhere between the third and fourth funnels, at the point of maximum stress, the ship's hull broke apart. The break likely began at the bottom of the ship and propagated upward, the steel plates and rivets failing under stresses they had never been designed to withstand. The bow section, now free of the stern's weight, sank rapidly, disappearing beneath the surface within seconds and beginning its long fall to the ocean floor 2.5 miles below. The stern section, which had briefly settled back toward level as the bow pulled away, now rose up again, standing nearly vertical in the water. Passengers and crew who had been standing on the stern deck were thrown off or forced to cling desperately to whatever they could grab. For a few moments, perhaps 20 or 30 seconds, the stern remained suspended, standing upright like a massive building rising from the ocean. Then, it too began to sink, sliding beneath the surface stern. First at 2:20 a.m. Those in the lifeboats, now several hundred yards away from where the ship had been, watched in horror as the great ship disappeared. Many reported that, as the stern went under, there was a tremendous roar, the sound of boilers and machinery breaking loose and crashing through the ship's interior, or perhaps the sound of air being forced out of the submerging hull. They heard the sounds of people in the water, more than 1,000 voices crying for help in the freezing ocean. The cries would continue for perhaps 20 or 30 minutes, and then gradually diminish as people succumbed to the cold. The water temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, below the freezing point of fresh water, but still liquid because of its salt content. In such cold water, a person's body temperature drops rapidly. Within minutes, the cold causes intense pain and interferes with the ability to swim or to move purposefully. Within 10 to 15 minutes, most people lose consciousness. Within 20 to 30 minutes, the heart stops. Most of those who went into the water did not drown but died from hypothermia, their bodies shutting down as their core temperature dropped to levels incompatible with life. Some survived longer, either because they had better insulation from body fat or clothing, or because they managed to find floating debris to climb onto that kept them partially out of the water. But very few survived more than 30 minutes in the water. Only one lifeboat, number 14, under the command of 5th Officer Harold Lowe, went back to pick up survivors from the water. Lowe transferred passengers from his overcrowded boat to other boats to make room, then returned to the area where the ship had gone down. He pulled several people from the water, but most of those he found were already dead, their bodies floating in life jackets, frozen by the cold. In total, only about 13 people were pulled from the water alive, and several of these died later from exposure and injuries. The other lifeboats did not return. Some occupants wanted to go back but were overruled by the crew members in charge, or by other passengers who feared being swamped by swimmers. Some boats were so underfilled that they could have safely taken on many more people, but their occupants could not bring themselves to row back into the area of screaming and dying. Within 45 minutes of the ship sinking, the cries from the water had ceased, and more than 1,500 people were dead. Their bodies floated in the debris field, held up by life jackets, scattered over several square miles of ocean. A scene of horror, illuminated by starlight. The rescue. The Carpathia arrived at the scene at approximately 4 a.m., nearly 2 hours after the Titanic had sunk. Captain Rostron had pushed his ship to the absolute limit, and his crew had prepared thoroughly for the arrival. But he was too late to save anyone except those already in lifeboats. The Carpathia approached cautiously, navigating through the same ice field that had destroyed the Titanic. In the early morning light, Rostron could see icebergs all around, some of them massive and some small, scattered across miles of ocean. It was a miracle that the Carpathia herself did not strike one. The Carpathia's crew began the process of picking up survivors, using rope ladders, cargo nets, and bosun's chairs, canvas slings, to bring people aboard. Some survivors were able to climb the rope ladders on their own, but many were too weak, too injured, or too traumatized to do so, and they had to be lifted aboard in the slings or carried by crew members. Children and injured adults were hoisted up in mail sacks or cargo nets. The process took several hours, as the lifeboats were scattered over several miles, and the Carpathia had to steam to each one and then carefully bring the occupants aboard. By 8:30 a.m., all survivors had been accounted for. 705 people had survived the sinking of the Titanic. More than 1,500 had died. The Carpathia set course for New York, carrying the survivors and the terrible news of the disaster. Captain Rostron and his crew provided what comfort and assistance they could, giving up their own cabins to survivors, providing clothing to those who had escaped in nightclothes, offering medical care to the injured, and respecting the grief of those who had lost loved ones. The ship's passengers donated clothing, blankets, and toiletries to the survivors, and they did what they could to help, despite being overwhelmed by the scale of the tragedy. The Californian, which had been less than 20 miles away when the Titanic struck the iceberg, did not arrive at the scene until after 8 a.m., by which time there was nothing to do but search for bodies. The Californian's wireless operator had been awakened shortly after 5:30 a.m. and had immediately learned of the disaster from other ships. Captain Lord ordered his ship to proceed to the Titanic's last known position, but by the time the Californian arrived, the Carpathia had already picked up all the survivors. The Californian found only wreckage and bodies floating in life jackets. The ship's failure to respond to the distress signals and rockets during the night would haunt Captain Lord for the rest of his life, and remains one of the most controversial aspects of the disaster. The aftermath. News of the disaster reached the outside world slowly and confusingly. The first wireless messages from the Carpathia were brief and fragmentary, and they were relayed through multiple stations, resulting in garbled or incomplete information. Initial reports were contradictory, with some sources reporting that all passengers had been saved, and that the Titanic was being towed to port. Other reports suggested that there had been loss of life, but understated the scale. It was not until the Carpathia arrived in New York on the evening of April 18th that the full scale of the tragedy became clear, and the world learned that more than 1,500 people had died. Crowds gathered at the pier in New York, desperate for information about loved ones. The scenes of reunion and grief were heartbreaking, as some families were reunited with survivors, while others learned that their relatives were among the dead. White Star Line officials attempted to provide information, but the company's records of who had been aboard were incomplete, and it took days to compile accurate lists of survivors and casualties. The casualty figures told a stark story about class and gender. Of the approximately 325 first-class passengers, about 200 survived, a survival rate of more than 60%. Of the approximately 285 second-class passengers, about 120 survived, a rate of about 42%. Of the approximately 710 third-class passengers, only about 175 survived, a rate of less than 25%. The disparity was even more pronounced when gender was considered. Among first-class women and children, the survival rate was about 97%. Almost all first-class women and children survived. Among third-class women and children, the survival rate was less than 50%. The survival rate for men was low across all classes, as the women and children first protocol was generally enforced. But third-class men fared the worst, with a survival rate of less than 15%. These statistics reflected multiple factors: the barriers that third-class passengers faced in reaching the boat deck, the prioritization of first-class passengers in boarding the lifeboats, the more consistent enforcement of the women and children first protocol in first class, and the simple geography of the ship, which placed third-class passengers farthest from the lifeboats. The disaster exposed the rigid class divisions of Edwardian society and demonstrated how those divisions could determine life and death. The bodies of victims were the subject of recovery efforts by ships dispatched from Halifax, Nova Scotia. The Mackay Bennett, a cable repair ship, was chartered by the White Star Line to search for bodies. The ship's crew recovered more than 300 bodies over the course of several weeks, identifying those they could and burying others at sea. Bodies that could be identified and that had family willing to claim them were embalmed and shipped to their destinations. Bodies that could not be identified or that were too badly decomposed were buried at sea with a brief ceremony. The Mackay Bennett's crew found the work deeply disturbing, and some crew members suffered psychological effects from handling hundreds of dead bodies, many of them children. Many bodies were never recovered, either because they sank before recovery ships arrived, or because they drifted away on currents, or because they were consumed by marine life. The total number of bodies recovered was about 340 out of more than 1,500 dead, meaning that the majority of victims were never found. Families were left without bodies to bury, without closure, without the rituals of death that might have helped them grieve. The investigations. 2 major investigations into the disaster were conducted, one by the United States Senate and one by the British Board of Trade. Both sought to determine the causes of the disaster, to assign responsibility, and to make recommendations for preventing similar tragedies in the future. The U.S. Senate inquiry, led by Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan, began on April 19th, just one day after the Carpathia arrived in New York, and continued for 18 days. The inquiry was conducted with unusual speed and thoroughness, and it called numerous witnesses, including surviving passengers, crew members, officials of the White Star Line, and wireless operators. J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, was subjected to particularly harsh questioning. Ismay had survived the sinking by boarding Collapsible Sea, one of the last boats to leave, and his survival when so many others had died made him a target for public anger and suspicion. Senator Smith questioned Ismay extensively about whether he had pressured Captain Smith to maintain speed despite ice warnings, whether he had taken a seat in a lifeboat before all women and children had been evacuated, and whether the White Star Line had prioritized profit over safety in the design and operation of the ship. Ismay maintained that he had not pressured the captain, that he had boarded a lifeboat only after being told by crew members that no more women and children were in the immediate area, and that the White Star Line had done everything reasonable to ensure the safety of passengers. However, Ismay's reputation never recovered, and he resigned as chairman of the White Star Line within a year. The U.S. inquiry heard testimony from more than 80 witnesses and produced a final report that was highly critical of multiple parties. The inquiry found that Captain Smith had been at fault for maintaining speed in dangerous waters, despite receiving multiple ice warnings. It found that the ship had carried insufficient lifeboats, and that the crew had not been adequately trained in evacuation procedures. It criticized the British Board of Trade for failing to update lifeboat regulations to account for modern ship sizes. It condemned the Californians' failure to respond to distress signals. The inquiry recommended numerous changes to maritime safety regulations, including requirements for sufficient lifeboats, 24-hour wireless operation, regular lifeboat drills, and better training for crew. The British inquiry, led by Lord Mersey and conducted under the auspices of the Board of Trade, began on May 2nd and lasted for 36 days. The British inquiry was more technical and more focused on the details of ship design and operation than the American inquiry. The inquiry examined the construction of the Titanic, the quality of materials and workmanship, the design of the watertight compartments, the decisions made by Captain Smith and his officers on the night of the sinking, and the adequacy of British maritime regulations. The inquiry heard from naval architects, shipbuilders, survivors, and experts in various fields. Lord Mersey's final report concluded that Captain Smith had been at fault for maintaining speed in ice-infested waters, but also noted that this was standard practice at the time, and that Smith had been following the customs of the sea rather than violating established protocols. The report noted that if Smith had slowed down, or altered course in response to the ice warnings, the collision would have been avoided. But it also acknowledged that captains who took such precautions were often criticized for being overcautious. The inquiry criticized the insufficient number of lifeboats and recommended that all ships carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. It examined the design of the watertight compartments and concluded that if the bulkheads had extended higher, the ship might have stayed afloat longer. It criticized the Board of Trade for maintaining outdated regulations that had not been updated to account for the increasing size of ships. Both inquiries contributed to significant changes in maritime safety regulations. In 1914, the first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, known as SOLAS, was convened in London. The convention brought together representatives from major maritime nations to develop new international standards for ship safety. The SOLAS Convention adopted requirements that all ships carry enough lifeboats for all passengers and crew, that wireless radio rooms be manned 24 hours a day, that ships conduct regular lifeboat drills, and that watertight bulkheads and compartments meet rigorous standards. The convention also led to the establishment of the International Ice Patrol, operated by the United States Coast Guard, which monitors iceberg activity in the North Atlantic and provides warnings to ships. Since the Ice Patrol began operations in 1914, no ship that has heeded its warnings has been lost to an iceberg collision in the North Atlantic. A remarkable safety record that demonstrates the value of learning from disaster. The cultural legacy. The Titanic disaster had an immediate and lasting impact on popular culture and collective memory. The sinking was front-page news around the world for weeks after the event, and it captured public imagination in a way that few disasters, before or since, have done. The combination of the ship's size and prestige, the loss of prominent wealthy passengers, the dramatic nature of the sinking, and the tragic failure of the unsinkable ship created a narrative that resonated deeply. Within months of the disaster, books, songs, and memorial poems were being published. Survivors wrote accounts of their experiences, and newspapers serialized their stories. The disaster was the subject of early films, including Saved from the Titanic, released just 29 days after the sinking and starring Dorothy Gibson, an actress who had actually survived the disaster and wore the same clothes in the film that she had worn on the night of the sinking. Over the decades, the Titanic has been the subject of countless books, from scholarly histories to personal memoirs to novels. Walter Lord's A Night to Remember, published in 1955, brought the disaster to a new generation with a meticulously researched and vividly written account that is still considered one of the definitive works on the subject. The book was adapted into a highly regarded British film in 1958. James Cameron's 1997 film Titanic introduced the story to yet another generation and became a global phenomenon. The film combined a fictional love story with a historically accurate depiction of the ship and its sinking, using state-of-the-art special effects and recreating the Titanic in extraordinary detail. The film won 11 Academy Awards and became one of the highest-grossing films of all time. For many people who were born long after the disaster, Cameron's film was their introduction to the Titanic story, and it renewed public interest in the historical event. The disaster has been commemorated in memorials around the world. In Belfast, where the ship was built, the Titanic Belfast Museum opened in 2012 on the centennial of the sinking. The museum, located on the site of the former Harland and Wolff shipyard, tells the story of the ship's construction, voyage, and sinking, and it has become one of Northern Ireland's most popular tourist attractions. In Southampton, where most of the crew lived and where the voyage began, memorials honor the hundreds of local residents who died, including the crew members' memorial that lists the names of all crew members lost. In Halifax, where many bodies were brought and buried, grave markers in 3 cemeteries, Fairview Lawn, Mount Olivet, and Baron de Hirsch, commemorate those who were recovered from the ocean. The graves have become sites of pilgrimage for Titanic enthusiasts. The Titanic has become a symbol that transcends the specific historical event. It represents hubris, the arrogance of believing that human technology can overcome nature, and the pride that leads to claims of unsinkability. It represents the class divisions and inequalities of the Edwardian era, when the life of a first-class passenger was valued more highly than that of a steerage passenger. Conclusion. The RMS Titanic was the largest, most luxurious ship of her time, a triumph of engineering and craftsmanship that represented the confidence and ambition of the Edwardian age. She was built by the finest shipyard in the world, using the best materials and techniques available.